Sarah Mitchell adjusted her dress blue uniform one final time before stepping out of her car. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Veterans Affairs Office building, and she could feel her heart beating faster than usual. Today was supposed to be a simple ceremony, a routine presentation about military honors to a group of local government officials and community leaders. She had given dozens of these presentations before, but something felt different this time. The Navy Cross gleamed on her chest, positioned exactly where regulations specified. It was her most prized possession, earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice during her deployment in Afghanistan 3 years earlier. The weight of the medal was familiar now, but it still reminded her of that terrible day when everything changed. She had been a Navy corpsman attached to a Marine unit, and when the improvised explosive device detonated near their convoy, she had risked everything to save her fellow service members. As Sarah walked toward the building entrance, she noticed several people already gathering in the lobby. There were men in expensive suits, women in professional attire, and a few individuals she recognized as local politicians. The presentation was part of a larger initiative to educate civilian leaders about military service and sacrifice, helping them better understand the veterans in their communities. The event coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Helen Barnes, greeted Sarah with a warm smile. Helen worked for the city council and had organized several similar events in the past. She seemed genuinely interested in honoring veterans and had personally requested that Sarah be the featured speaker. Helen had heard about Sarah's heroic actions and wanted the community to hear her story directly from her. Sarah was led to a small preparation room where she could review her notes and compose herself before the presentation. The room was quiet, with only the soft hum of air conditioning and distant conversations from the main hall. She had prepared thoroughly, crafting a speech that would explain the significance of various military decorations while sharing some of her own experiences in a way that would resonate with civilians 20 minutes before the scheduled start time. Helen knocked on the door and entered with an apologetic expression. Behind her stood a tall, stern-looking man in his 50s wearing a crisp business suit. His name tag identified him as Robert Thornton, Deputy Director of Municipal Affairs. Sarah had never met him before, but his reputation preceded him. He was known for his rigid adherence to protocol and his sometimes abrasive personality. Thornton's eyes immediately focused on Sarah's Navy Cross, and his expression grew disapproving. He cleared his throat and spoke in a tone that left no room for argument. The medal, he declared, was inappropriate for this type of civilian gathering. He claimed that wearing such a high military decoration might make some attendees uncomfortable or feel excluded. Furthermore, he suggested that it could be seen as boastful or attention-seeking behavior. Sarah felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She tried to explain that the Navy Cross was an integral part of her presentation. It was one of the decorations she planned to discuss, and wearing it helped illustrate the significance of military honors. She had never considered that her medal might be perceived as inappropriate or offensive. The decoration represented the most difficult day of her life, when she had saved 3 Marines despite being wounded herself. Thornton remained unmoved by her explanation. He insisted that for the sake of the event's success and to maintain an inclusive atmosphere, she should remove the medal immediately. He even suggested that she could hold it in her hand during the relevant portion of her presentation if necessary. But wearing it was simply unacceptable. His tone grew more demanding as he spoke, making it clear that he considered this a non-negotiable directive. Helen looked uncomfortable with the confrontation, but seemed reluctant to contradict Thornton's authority. She offered a weak smile and suggested that perhaps there could be a compromise, but Thornton quickly dismissed any discussion. He checked his watch impatiently and reminded them that the presentation was scheduled to begin soon, and he needed this matter resolved immediately. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached toward her chest. The Navy Cross had been pinned to her uniform countless times, but she had never been asked to remove it under circumstances like these. Each time she wore it, she remembered the faces of the Marines she had helped save, young men who had gone on to live full lives because of her actions that day. The medal wasn't just a piece of metal and ribbon. It was a symbol of sacrifice, courage, and the bond between service members. As her fingers touched the medal's edges, Sarah thought about the ceremony where she had first received it. Her commanding officer had spoken about the values it represented and the responsibility that came with wearing it. He had emphasized that the Navy Cross was not just an individual honor, but a recognition of the entire military community's commitment to service and sacrifice. The idea of removing it now felt like a betrayal of those values. Thornton tapped his foot impatiently while Sarah hesitated. He reminded her that there were important people waiting in the main hall: city council members, business leaders, and other influential community figures. He couldn't afford to have the event delayed by what he characterized as unnecessary drama over a piece of military jewelry. His dismissive attitude toward her medal only strengthened Sarah's resolve, but she found herself caught between her principles and the practical reality of the situation. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of voices from the main hall, where the audience was gathering. Sarah could hear chairs being arranged and conversations beginning as people settled in for her presentation. These were the people she was meant to educate about military service and the significance of military honors. How could she teach them about respect for military decorations while being forced to remove her own? Helen glanced nervously between Sarah and Thornton, clearly wishing she could disappear from the uncomfortable situation. She had organized this event with the best intentions, hoping to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities. Now it seemed like her efforts were creating division instead of understanding. Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. Her fingers began to work at the medal's clasp, her heart heavy with the weight of compromise. She had faced enemy fire and life-threatening situations, but this moment felt like one of the most difficult challenges of her military career. As she prepared to remove the Navy Cross, neither she nor anyone else in the room could have predicted what was about to happen next. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway outside the preparation room, growing louder with each passing second. Sarah's fingers were still working at the clasp of her Navy Cross when the footsteps stopped directly outside the door. There was a brief moment of silence before 3 sharp knocks interrupted the tense atmosphere in the room. Helen called out for whoever was outside to enter, and the door opened to reveal a figure that immediately commanded attention. Colonel James Iron Mike Rodriguez stepped into the room with the bearing and presence that only came from decades of military service. He was a large man with graying hair and weathered features that spoke of countless hours spent in harsh conditions around the world. His marine dress blue uniform was immaculate, with rows of ribbons and decorations that told the story of a distinguished career spanning multiple deployments and conflicts. The colonel's eyes quickly surveyed the scene before him. Sarah with her hands on her Navy Cross, Thornton standing with his arms crossed in an authoritative pose, and Helen looking distinctly uncomfortable. Rodriguez had been invited to the event as a special guest due to his position as the Regional Marine Corps liaison, but he had arrived earlier than expected and had been looking for the preparation room to introduce himself to the speaker. Thornton immediately straightened up when he saw the Marine officer, though his expression remained defiant. He was accustomed to being the authority figure in civilian settings and wasn't about to back down simply because a military officer had entered the room. In fact, he seemed to view the colonel's arrival as an opportunity to reinforce his position about the inappropriateness of wearing military decorations at civilian events. Rodriguez's trained eyes immediately recognized the Navy Cross on Sarah's chest, and his expression grew serious. He had served alongside Navy corpsmen throughout his career, and had tremendous respect for the courage and skill they displayed in combat. The sight of someone being forced to remove such a prestigious decoration triggered an immediate protective instinct that was deeply ingrained in his military character. Sarah stopped trying to remove her medal and came to attention when she saw the colonel, recognizing his rank and the respect it commanded. She had worked with Marines before and understood the hierarchy and customs that governed military interactions. Her training kicked in automatically, despite the civilian setting and the unusual circumstances she found herself facing. Thornton, unaware of the significance of what he was witnessing, decided to explain the situation to the colonel. He spoke, in the same dismissive tone he had used with Sarah, describing the Navy Cross as inappropriate for the civilian audience and explaining his decision to have it removed. He seemed to expect that the colonel would understand and support his position, perhaps even help enforce his directive. The colonel listened silently while Thornton spoke, his expression growing darker with each word. Rodriguez had spent 32 years in the Marine Corps, rising through the ranks from an enlisted man to his current position. He had seen countless acts of heroism and had personally recommended numerous service members for various decorations. The idea that someone would be forced to remove a Navy Cross, one of the military's highest honors, was personally offensive to him. When Thornton finished his explanation, Rodriguez asked a simple question that cut through all the bureaucratic nonsense. "Do you know what the Navy Cross represents?" His voice was calm, but carried an underlying edge that suggested Thornton should choose his next words very carefully. The question wasn't really seeking information, it was a challenge to Thornton's authority and judgment. Thornton responded with the same condescending attitude he had shown throughout the encounter. He dismissed the medal as just another piece of military jewelry and suggested that the colonel was missing the bigger picture about civilian sensitivities. He even went so far as to imply that military personnel sometimes failed to understand the nuances of civilian events and protocol. The colonel's jaw tightened as Thornton spoke, but he maintained his composure with the discipline that had been drilled into him over decades of service. Rodriguez understood that he was in a civilian setting and needed to handle the situation appropriately, but he also had a duty to protect the honor and integrity of military decorations and the service members who earned them. Sarah watched the exchange with growing hope and anxiety. She could see that the colonel was on her side, but she also worried about the potential consequences of a confrontation between military and civilian authority figures. The last thing she wanted was for her situation to create a larger conflict that might damage relationships between the military and civilian communities. Rodriguez turned to Sarah and asked her to explain how she had earned the Navy Cross. His tone was respectful and encouraging, clearly intended to give her an opportunity to educate Thornton and Helen about the significance of her decoration. He wanted them to understand that they weren't dealing with a simple piece of military jewelry, but with a symbol of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Sarah began to recount the events of that day in Afghanistan, her voice growing stronger, as she described the convoy attack and her decision to risk her own life to save wounded Marines. She explained how she had crawled through enemy fire to reach the injured men, how she had provided life-saving medical treatment under impossible conditions, and how she had continued to care for them even after being wounded herself. As Sarah spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Helen's expression changed from nervous uncertainty to growing understanding and respect. Even Thornton seemed to be listening more carefully, though his stubborn pride prevented him from immediately backing down from his earlier position. The colonel nodded approvingly as Sarah described her actions, occasionally adding context about the tactical situation and the level of danger she had faced. Rodriguez then took over the narrative, explaining the rigorous process involved in awarding a Navy Cross. He described how multiple witnesses had to provide statements, how the recommendation had to be reviewed at several levels of command, and how the final decision had to be approved by the highest levels of military leadership. He emphasized that fewer than 1% of service members ever receive such a high decoration, making it an extraordinarily rare and prestigious honor. The colonel's explanation had a profound effect on everyone in the room. Helen began to understand the magnitude of what Thornton was asking Sarah to do, and her expression showed growing dismay at the situation. Even Thornton seemed to realize that he had seriously underestimated the significance of the Navy Cross, though his pride still prevented him from admitting his mistake openly. Rodriguez then addressed Thornton directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of Marines in combat. He explained that asking a Navy Cross recipient to remove their medal was not just inappropriate, but deeply disrespectful to the entire military community. He compared it to asking a Medal of Honor recipient to hide their decoration, emphasizing that such actions undermined the very values the event was supposed to promote. The room fell silent as the weight of the colonel's words settled over everyone present. The confrontation had reached a critical moment where someone would have to back down, and the tension was palpable. Sarah stood perfectly still, her Navy Cross still gleaming on her chest, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 15 seconds. Thornton's face had grown pale as the full weight of Colonel Rodriguez's words sank in. His earlier confidence was rapidly evaporating as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The Navy Cross wasn't just any military decoration. It was second only to the Medal of Honor in terms of prestige and significance. Colonel Rodriguez stepped closer to Thornton, his presence filling the small room with an almost tangible authority. When he spoke again, his voice was measured but firm, carrying the weight of decades of military experience and leadership. He explained that throughout his 32-year career, he had only personally known 3 Navy Cross recipients, making Sarah's presence at the event an extraordinary honor for the entire community. Rodriguez began to share some of his own experiences working with Navy corpsmen in combat zones. He described how these medical personnel routinely risked their lives to save Marines, often running into dangerous situations when everyone else was seeking cover. His voice carried genuine emotion as he spoke about corpsmen who had died trying to save his Marines, and others who had performed miracles under impossible circumstances. Sarah listened to the colonel's words with a mixture of pride and humility. She had never considered herself a hero. In her mind, she had simply done what any good corpsman would do in that situation. But hearing Rodriguez describe the respect that Marines had for Navy medical personnel helped her understand why her actions that day had been deemed worthy of such a high decoration. Helen Barnes, the event coordinator, finally found her voice and spoke up. She apologized profusely to Sarah, explaining that she had no idea there would be any issue with military decorations at the event. Helen had specifically requested Sarah as a speaker because she wanted the community to hear about military service from someone who had actually experienced combat. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. They had invited a hero to speak about military honors, then tried to prevent her from wearing her own medal. Thornton remained silent, his earlier bravado completely deflated. He was clearly struggling with how to extract himself from the situation without losing face completely. As a civilian official, he was accustomed to having the final word in most situations, but this was clearly beyond his area of expertise. The colonel's presence and authority had shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Rodriguez then did something unexpected. He began to remove his own decorations from his uniform. Starting with his silver star, he carefully unpinned each medal and ribbon, placing them on the small table in the center of the room. As he worked, he explained what each decoration represented, creating a growing display of military honors that told the story of his distinguished career. The sight of the Marine colonel removing his own decorations had an immediate and powerful effect on everyone in the room. If Rodriguez, a man who had clearly earned the right to wear his medals, was willing to remove them to make a point, then the absurdity of asking Sarah to remove hers became impossible to ignore. It was a brilliant tactical move that demonstrated the principle without creating direct confrontation. Sarah understood immediately what the colonel was doing and felt a surge of gratitude for his support. She also realized that she couldn't allow him to continue removing his decorations on her behalf. Before Rodriguez could unpin his Purple Heart, she stepped forward and placed her hand gently on his arm, stopping him from continuing his demonstration. Speaking directly to Thornton for the first time since the confrontation began, Sarah made an offer that surprised everyone in the room. She suggested that if her Navy Cross truly made the audience uncomfortable, she would be happy to explain during her presentation why she was wearing it and what it represented. This way, any concerns about the decoration could be addressed openly and educationally, rather than through forced removal. The offer was brilliant in its simplicity and demonstrated Sarah's maturity and professionalism. Instead of creating an adversarial situation, she was proposing to turn the controversy into a teaching moment. It would allow her to maintain her dignity and honor, while also addressing any legitimate concerns about civilian understanding of military decorations. Rodriguez immediately supported Sarah's proposal, noting that education was the entire purpose of the event. He pointed out that hiding military honors would actually defeat the goal of helping civilians understand and appreciate military service. The colonel's endorsement carried significant weight, and it became clear that this was the solution everyone could accept. Helen eagerly agreed to the proposal, recognizing it as a perfect way to resolve the situation while actually enhancing the educational value of the event. She began discussing how they could modify the presentation to include more detailed explanation of military decorations and their significance. Her enthusiasm was genuine, She could see how this approach would make the event more meaningful for everyone involved. Thornton found himself in an impossible position. He could either accept the reasonable compromise that everyone else supported, or continue to appear unreasonable and disrespectful to military service. His pride was clearly wounded, but he had no choice but to agree to the modified approach. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the authority and confidence he had displayed earlier. Rodriguez began repinning his decorations to his uniform, a process that seemed to restore the proper order to the room. As he worked, he continued to explain the significance of each medal, creating an impromptu educational session that served as a preview of what the audience would soon experience. His knowledge and passion for military history were evident in every word he spoke. As the tension in the room finally began to dissipate, Sarah felt a tremendous sense of relief and gratitude. The Navy Cross remained on her chest where it belonged, and she would now have the opportunity to share its significance with people who genuinely wanted to learn. The confrontation that had seemed so threatening just minutes earlier had been transformed into an opportunity for deeper understanding. Helen checked her watch and realized that the presentation was scheduled to begin in just a few minutes. The audience had been waiting patiently in the main hall, completely unaware of the drama that had been unfolding behind the scenes. She suggested that they should move to the presentation area, where Sarah could begin her modified presentation that would now include the story behind her Navy Cross. As they prepared to leave the preparation room, Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside for a brief private conversation. He wanted to ensure that she felt ready to proceed with the presentation after the emotional confrontation she had just experienced. His concern was genuine. He understood how challenging it could be to maintain composure and effectiveness after being subjected to such disrespectful treatment. Sarah assured the colonel that she was ready to continue with the presentation. In fact, she felt more motivated than ever to share her story and help the civilian audience understand the true meaning of military service and sacrifice. The confrontation with Thornton had reminded her why events like this were so important. There was still significant work to be done in bridging the gap between military and civilian communities. They walked toward the main hall. Sarah could hear the buzz of conversation from the waiting audience. These were community leaders, business people, and government officials who had taken time from their busy schedules to learn about military service. She was determined to give them a presentation they would never forget, one that would help them understand not just the facts about military decorations, but the human stories behind them. The main hall was filled with approximately 50 attendees, representing a cross-section of the local community's leadership. City council members sat alongside business executives, nonprofit directors, and several retired military personnel who had heard about the event and wanted to show their support. The atmosphere was warm and expectant as people chatted quietly among themselves, waiting for the presentation to begin. Helen Barnes stepped to the podium first to introduce the event and provide some background context. She spoke about the importance of civilian-military relationships and the value of understanding the experiences of veterans in their community. Her introduction was heartfelt and genuine, reflecting her personal commitment to honoring military service, though she made no mention of the drama that had just occurred backstage. When Helen introduced Sarah, the audience applauded respectfully. Several people in the front rows immediately noticed the Navy Cross on Sarah's chest, though most of the civilian attendees probably didn't recognize its significance. The retired military personnel in the audience certainly knew what they were seeing, and their expressions showed both surprise and deep respect for the young woman approaching the podium. Sarah began her presentation with confidence, despite the emotional roller coaster she had just experienced. She had restructured her opening remarks to address the elephant in the room immediately, explaining that she would be discussing her own decorations as part of the educational process. Her direct approach helped set the tone for an honest and meaningful conversation about military service and recognition. Colonel Rodriguez had taken a seat in the front row where Sarah could see him, providing visible support and encouragement. His presence gave her additional confidence, and she found herself speaking with increased passion about the topics she had originally planned to cover. The confrontation with Thornton had actually strengthened her resolve to ensure the audience truly understood the significance of military honors. As Sarah began to explain the hierarchy of military decorations, Starting with basic service medals and working her way up to combat awards, the audience became increasingly engaged. Many of these community leaders had never heard detailed explanations of how military recognition worked, and they were fascinated by the complexity and rigor of the process. Their questions showed genuine curiosity and respect for the military system. When Sarah reached the portion of her presentation about the Navy Cross, she paused and acknowledged the significance of the moment. She explained that she hadn't originally planned to share her personal story in such detail, but that circumstances had convinced her that it would be valuable for the audience to understand what the medal actually represented. The room fell completely silent as she began to recount the events in Afghanistan. Sarah's description of the convoy attack was vivid and emotional, but she maintained her composure throughout. She explained how the improvised explosive device had detonated near their vehicles, causing massive casualties among the Marines she was accompanying. Her voice remained steady as she described the chaos, confusion, and immediate danger that followed the explosion, though some members of the audience could see tears forming in her eyes. The audience was completely captivated as Sarah described her decision to leave the relative safety of her position to help the wounded Marines. She explained how her medical training had kicked in automatically, overriding her natural fear and self-preservation instincts. Her description of crawling through active gunfire to reach the casualties painted a picture that none of the civilian attendees had ever heard firsthand before. Several audience members were visibly moved as Sarah described treating the wounded Marines while under enemy fire. She explained how she had used her own body to shield one critically injured Marine while providing life-saving medical treatment, and how she had continued working even after shrapnel from a second explosion had wounded her own leg. Her matter-of-fact delivery made the heroism even more powerful. Colonel Rodriguez watched Sarah's presentation with obvious pride and respect. He had read the official citation for her Navy Cross, but hearing her tell the story in her own words gave it a human dimension that no official document could capture. He could see that the audience was developing a deep appreciation not just for Sarah's individual courage, but for the broader concept of military service and sacrifice. When Sarah finished describing the events that led to her Navy Cross, she took a moment to explain the medal's significance within the military hierarchy. She noted that it was the second highest decoration for combat valor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. Her explanation helped the audience understand that they weren't just looking at a piece of military jewelry, but at a symbol representing actions that had saved lives at great personal risk. The first question from the audience came from Margaret Chen, a local business owner whose son was currently serving in the Army. She asked how Sarah had maintained her composure and effectiveness under such terrifying circumstances. Sarah's response revealed her deep commitment to her fellow service members and her professional medical training, explaining that in that moment, the only thing that mattered was saving the lives of the wounded Marines. Another audience member, David Walsh, a retired police officer, asked about the psychological impact of such experiences. Sarah acknowledged that the transition back to civilian life had been challenging, but that she had received excellent support from military mental health services and veteran organizations. Her honest discussion of post-traumatic stress and recovery helped demystify these issues for the civilian audience. As the question and answer session continued, it became clear that Sarah's presentation was having exactly the impact Helen had hoped for when she first organized the event. The audience was gaining genuine understanding and appreciation for military service, and several people mentioned that they would never look at veterans in their community the same way again. The educational goals were being achieved in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations. Thornton, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room throughout the presentation, finally stood up to ask a question. His voice was noticeably different from the authoritative tone he had used earlier, more humble and respectful. He asked Sarah what civilians could do to better support veterans in their community, acknowledging that many people wanted to help but weren't sure how to approach the subject appropriately. Sarah's response to Thornton's question was gracious and constructive, showing no trace of the conflict they had experienced earlier. She explained that most veterans simply wanted to be treated with respect and understanding, and that simple gestures like thanking them for their service or learning about their experiences could mean a great deal. Her professional handling of the question demonstrated the kind of character that had earned her the Navy Cross in the first place. Colonel Rodriguez then stood up to add his own perspective to the discussion. He spoke about the importance of community support for veterans and their families, and how events like this presentation helped bridge the gap between military and civilian worlds. His comments reinforced Sarah's message while adding the perspective of a senior military leader who had seen the positive impact of strong civilian-military relationships. As the formal presentation concluded, several audience members approached Sarah individually to thank her for sharing her story and to ask additional questions. The retired military personnel in the audience were particularly eager to speak with her, sharing their own experiences and expressing their admiration for her service and her Navy Cross. The atmosphere was warm and respectful, exactly what Helen had envisioned when she first planned the event. Helen Barnes watched the interactions with obvious satisfaction, knowing that the event had accomplished far more than she had originally hoped. The near disaster with Thornton's objections had actually transformed into an opportunity for deeper education and understanding. She made mental notes about how to structure future events to maximize these kinds of meaningful exchanges between military and civilian community members. As people began to filter out of the hall, continuing their conversations in small groups, it was clear that Sarah's presentation had made a lasting impact. Several audience members mentioned that they planned to research more about military decorations and veteran issues, while others expressed interest in volunteering with local veteran organizations. The ripple effects of the presentation would extend far beyond the event itself. As the crowd began to thin out, Robert Thornton approached Sarah with obvious discomfort written across his face. Gone was the authoritative bureaucrat who had demanded she remove her Navy Cross just an hour earlier. In his place stood a man who had experienced a profound shift in understanding and was struggling with how to address his earlier behavior. His hands were clasped behind his back and he appeared to be searching for the right words. Sarah noticed Thornton approaching and braced herself for another potential confrontation. However, his body language and expression suggested something entirely different from their earlier encounter. Colonel Rodriguez, who had been standing nearby talking with some of the retired military attendees, noticed the approaching interaction and positioned himself where he could observe, but not interfere. When Thornton finally spoke, his voice was quiet and filled with genuine remorse. He began by acknowledging that he had made a serious mistake earlier, admitting that he had completely misunderstood the significance of Sarah's Navy Cross and the appropriateness of her wearing it. His apology was lengthy and heartfelt, revealing a man who had been genuinely humbled by the education he had received during Sarah's presentation. Thornton went on to explain that his earlier actions had come from a place of ignorance rather than malice. He admitted that he had never served in the military and had very little understanding of military culture or traditions. His experience with veterans had been limited to administrative interactions, and he had never taken the time to learn about the significance of military decorations or the experiences behind them. Sarah listened to Thornton's apology with grace and understanding. Despite the disrespect he had shown her earlier, she recognized that his current remorse was genuine and that he had learned valuable lessons from the experience. Her response was measured and professional, acknowledging his apology while also expressing hope that he would use this experience to better understand and support veterans in the future. The conversation between Sarah and Thornton was observed by several audience members who remained in the hall. Word of the earlier confrontation had begun to spread among the attendees, though the details were unclear to most people. Seeing Thornton publicly apologize to Sarah sent a powerful message about accountability and the importance of treating military service members with appropriate respect. Colonel Rodriguez approached the pair as their conversation was concluding and offered his own perspective on the situation. He spoke directly to Thornton about the responsibility that community leaders have to educate themselves about the populations they serve, including veterans. His tone was firm but not harsh, treating the incident as a learning opportunity rather than a punitive situation. Rodriguez then shared some statistics about the veteran population in their local area, information that clearly surprised Thornton. The colonel explained that there were over 3,000 veterans living in the county, representing nearly 10% of the adult population. Many of these veterans had served in combat zones and had earned various decorations for their service. Understanding their experiences and showing Appropriate respect was essential for effective community leadership. Helen Barnes joined the group and expressed her gratitude to everyone for how the situation had been handled. She admitted that she had been terrified that the confrontation might derail the entire event. But instead, it had created an even more meaningful learning experience. She suggested that future events should include more detailed education about military traditions and customs for civilian participants. As the conversation continued, Thornton asked several thoughtful questions about how he and other civilian officials could better support veterans in their community. His questions demonstrated genuine interest in making amends for his earlier mistake and ensuring that similar situations wouldn't occur in the future. Both Sarah and Colonel Rodriguez provided practical suggestions and resources that could help him develop better understanding. One of the most significant outcomes of the discussion was Thornton's commitment to establish a veteran liaison position within the municipal government. He recognized that having someone with military experience involved in policy decisions affecting veterans could prevent misunderstandings like the one that had occurred earlier. This was exactly the kind of positive change that events like Sarah's presentation were meant to inspire. Margaret Chen, the business owner whose son was serving in the Army, approached the group and shared her perspective on the morning's events. She explained that watching the confrontation and its resolution had taught her important lessons about standing up for military service members and challenging misconceptions when they encountered them. Her comments reinforced the broader impact that Sarah's courage had achieved. Several other audience members gathered around to continue the discussion, creating an impromptu forum about civilian-military relations. The conversation covered topics ranging from employment challenges facing veterans to the importance of recognizing and honoring military service in community events. The depth and quality of the discussion exceeded what anyone had expected from the original presentation format. Dr. James Patterson, a retired Marine who had attended the event, shared his own experiences with misunderstanding and disrespect from civilians who didn't understand military culture. His stories helped illustrate that Sarah's experience, while extreme, was not entirely unique. Many veterans had faced situations where their service was misunderstood or dismissed by well-meaning but ignorant civilian officials. The group discussion revealed several specific areas where the civilian community could improve its support for veterans. These included better understanding of military traditions and customs, more comprehensive services for veterans transitioning to civilian careers, and increased recognition of veteran contributions to the community. The participants began discussing concrete steps that could be taken to address these issues. Sarah found herself in the unexpected role of educator and advocate, helping to explain military perspectives to the engaged civilian audience. Her patience and professionalism in this role demonstrated the same character that had earned her the Navy Cross in combat. She was able to translate complex military concepts into language that civilians could understand and appreciate, Colonel Rodriguez observed. Sarah's interaction with the group and was impressed by her natural leadership abilities and communication skills. He made a mental note to recommend her for future speaking engagements and possibly for involvement in formal civilian-military liaison programs. Her combination of combat experience, professional expertise, and communication skills made her an ideal ambassador for the military community. As the discussion continued, it became clear that the morning's events had created unexpected opportunities for positive change in the community. What had started as a simple educational presentation had evolved into a catalyst for improved understanding and cooperation between military and civilian leaders. The near confrontation over Sarah's Navy Cross had ultimately strengthened rather than damaged these important relationships. Helen Barnes was already making plans for follow-up events that would build on the success of Sarah's presentation. She envisioned a series of programs that would bring together military and civilian community members to address specific issues and challenges. The enthusiasm shown by the audience suggested that there was significant interest in continuing these important conversations. The transformation in Thornton's attitude and understanding was particularly striking to everyone who witnessed it. From an official who had demanded the removal of a Navy Cross to someone committed to improving veteran services, his change represented the kind of education and growth that these events were meant to achieve. His public acknowledgement of his mistake also demonstrated the importance of accountability in leadership positions. As the informal discussion began to wind down, several participants exchanged contact information and made commitments to continue working together on veteran-related issues. The networking and relationship building that occurred represented tangible benefits that would extend far beyond the original event. Sarah's courage in standing up for her right to wear her Navy Cross had created opportunities that none of them had anticipated. 6 months after the presentation at the Veterans Affairs Building, the ripple effects of that morning's events continued to spread throughout the community in ways that no one could have predicted. Sarah Mitchell had become something of a local hero, not just for her military service, but for the dignity and courage she had shown in defending the honor of military decorations against bureaucratic ignorance. The veteran liaison position that Robert Thornton had proposed during their post-presentation discussion had been approved by the City Council and filled by Master Sergeant retired Maria Gonzalez, a combat veteran with extensive experience in military-civilian relations. Her appointment marked the first time the municipality had formally recognized the need for military expertise in local government decisions, and her influence was already being felt across multiple departments. Thornton himself had undergone a remarkable transformation since that awkward morning. He had enrolled in a continuing education program about military history and veteran affairs, spending his own time and money to better understand the community he served. His newfound knowledge had made him one of the most effective advocates for veteran issues within the municipal government, and he frequently credited Sarah's courage for opening his eyes to his own ignorance. The presentation had also inspired Helen Barnes to establish an ongoing speaker series called Bridging the Gap, which brought together military and civilian community members monthly to discuss various topics. Sarah had become a regular participant, sharing her expertise and experiences with audiences that grew larger with each event. Her natural speaking ability and authentic approach had made her one of the most requested speakers in the program. Colonel Rodriguez had kept in touch with Sarah throughout the months following their first meeting and had eventually offered her a position as a civilian military liaison with the Marine Corps Reserve Unit in the region. The part-time role allowed her to continue her work as a nurse practitioner, while also helping to educate civilian communities about military service. It was the perfect marriage of her medical skills and her passion for veteran advocacy. The story of Sarah's confrontation with Thornton had spread beyond the local community through word of mouth and social media. Other municipalities had reached out to Helen Barnes for advice on organizing similar educational events, and Sarah had been invited to speak at conferences and gatherings throughout the state. Her message about the importance of understanding and respecting military service had resonated with audiences far beyond her original local presentation. One of the most significant developments had been the establishment of a scholarship fund in Sarah's name, created by Margaret Chen and several other local business leaders who had attended the original presentation. The scholarship was designed to support children of military families pursuing careers in healthcare, combining recognition of Sarah's military service with her civilian profession as a nurse practitioner. The 3 Marines, whom Sarah had saved during the convoy attack in Afghanistan, had learned about her civilian advocacy work through mutual military contacts. They had surprised her by attending one of her presentations, bringing their families to meet the woman who had saved their lives. Their presence had added powerful emotional weight to her message about the human cost of military service and the bonds formed between service members in combat. Dr. James Patterson, the retired Marine who had participated in the post-presentation discussion, had worked with Sarah to develop a comprehensive training program for civilian officials who interacted with veterans. The program covered military culture, customs, and traditions, as well as practical information about veteran benefits and services. Several government agencies and nonprofit organizations had already implemented the training for their staff. The local newspaper had eventually picked up the story of Sarah's confrontation with Thornton and the positive changes that had resulted from it. The article had focused on the power of education and dialogue to overcome misunderstanding and prejudice, using their experience as an example of how conflicts could be transformed into opportunities for growth and improvement. Sarah's Navy Cross continued to generate conversations wherever she went, but now those conversations were educational rather than confrontational. People who met her often asked about the medal's significance, providing her with opportunities to share not just her own story, but the broader history of military recognition and sacrifice. Each conversation helped to build greater understanding and appreciation for military service in the civilian community. The success of the local program had attracted attention from national veteran advocacy organizations, and Sarah had been invited to participate in a documentary about military-civilian relations. The film would feature her story alongside those of other veterans who had worked to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities, potentially reaching audiences across the country. Thornton had surprised everyone by becoming one of Sarah's most dedicated supporters, often introducing her at speaking events and sharing his own story of education and growth. His transformation from antagonist to ally had become an integral part of the message they shared about the possibility for change and understanding. Their partnership demonstrated that even the most challenging confrontations could lead to positive outcomes when approached with openness and respect. The original presentation that had almost been derailed by Thornton's objections to Sarah's Navy Cross had become a template for similar events in other communities. Helen Barnes had developed a comprehensive guide for organizing military-civilian educational programs, incorporating the lessons learned from their experience. The guide was being distributed to community organizations across several states. Sarah's work had also led to improvements in veteran services at the local level, including expanded mental health programs, job training opportunities, and family support services. Her combination of military experience and healthcare expertise had made her uniquely qualified to identify gaps in services and advocate for solutions that address the real needs of veteran families. The scholarship fund created in Sarah's name had grown substantially, eventually expanding beyond its original focus to support various educational opportunities for military families. The fund's success had inspired similar initiatives in neighboring communities, creating a network of support that extended throughout the region. As Sarah reflected on the events of that morning 6 months earlier, she realized that Thornton's attempt to force her to remove her Navy Cross had ultimately created far more opportunities than it had threatened to destroy. The confrontation had been painful and disrespectful, but it had also revealed important gaps in understanding that needed to be addressed. Her courage in standing firm had not only protected her own dignity but had opened doors for countless other veterans who would benefit from the improved awareness and services that had resulted. The Navy Cross still gleamed on Sarah's chest during formal occasions, but now it represented not just her individual heroism in Afghanistan, but her ongoing commitment to serving her fellow veterans and building bridges between military and civilian communities. The medal had become a symbol of hope and education rather than division and misunderstanding. Colonel Rodriguez often said that Sarah's greatest act of courage hadn't been crawling through enemy fire in Afghanistan, but standing up to bureaucratic ignorance in a small preparation room at the Veterans Affairs Building. Her willingness to defend the honor of military service had created positive changes that would benefit veterans for years to come. The story of Sarah Mitchell and her Navy Cross had become a powerful example of how individual courage and dignity could overcome institutional ignorance and create lasting positive change. It demonstrated that the values represented by military decorations, courage, sacrifice, and service, were just as relevant in civilian life as they were on the battlefield. Most importantly, it showed that understanding and respect could triumph over prejudice and ignorance when people were willing to engage in honest dialogue and education. The morning that had started with a demand to hide military honor had ended with a community-wide commitment to understanding and celebrating the service of its veteran population. Sarah's Navy Cross would never again be questioned in her community. Instead, it would serve as a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when facing opposition from those in positions of authority.